Good morning, people. Let's talk about Master John Hackleman and his Hawaiian Kempo system. And this was an interview I saw on Art of One Dojo, and I want to focus on something he said and how he said it and why I think he's a bit mistaken on this. All right. So he talked about his background in Kaji Kempo, and that was one of the foundations of his art. It seems like more like the biggest foundation of his art, excepting martial sports. All right, obviously boxing, kickboxing, wrestling has a huge influence on him, but growing up he found his home in Kaji Kempo. Now, I'm not a black belt in Kaji Kempo, but I am going to say this. I have some qualifications to talk about what he's talking about. When Panther videos first came out in the 80s, I discovered Gary Forbach's Kaji Kempo series, and at different points in my life I've watched I think every tape in that series, right? And I love that. I love Kaji Kempo. I practiced the techniques with my student. I had a student who was a bouncer, and he's a big guy, but he worked at a place called Club Zadar's. I think it was in New Hope, Pennsylvania, and they had a problem with young men that were bodybuilders on steroids and on methamphetamines, and they would come in there and cause trouble, and it would be really difficult for the bouncers to control them. And this guy Travis Leixenring, good friend of mine then, and we're still friends, but he lives all the way in California. So we don't talk much except on Facebook now and then. I remember, when I first discovered the Kaji Kempo grab arts, self-defense tape, and we went over it, and we even experimented with modifying some of the techniques against punches, and I just thought it was cool as all hell. And we practiced it. The techniques we kind of did slow-mo because they were new to us, in my basement for about a half hour, and then we moved on to the other stuff we had planned for the day. And next couple of weeks he's like, by the way, that stuff works. Like, he began immediately employing this stuff almost instinctively. And he also had an altercation at Mercer County Community College where someone he knew was getting beaten up in the parking lot over a girl, if I recall. And he intervened, and he's like, wow, I was, the ridge hand to the groin followed by the elbow. He says, I hit the guy in the groin, and he dropped before the elbow. I wondered where it disappeared to, and there was a follow-through punch, and he looked down, and that guy was holding his groin in pain. So I was like, wow, this Kaji Kempo, and by extension Kempo stuff, is really cool, all right? So over my life, I've been exploring it. I still like going over techniques with other black belts, the sparring techniques, the punch defenses, and I like seeing, okay, how can we do this against boxing? How can we do this against the grappler, someone pulling guard or shooting in? And it's always funny how oftentimes the people around me that I'm teaching or exchanging with wind up using this stuff more than me. Maybe it's just, I may not be the target I was, and as I get older, I do try to be more aware, do try to avoid trouble. When faced with it, I'll often be mentally and verbally confrontational, and if I can't de-escalate, I'll try to just show them, okay, you're not going to get an easy fight out of me. Okay, this is going to be a lot more difficult than you thought it was going to be. So maybe that's a factor. So John Hackleman talked about, he got rid of all the katas and all the useless stuff, and he said there's a lot of useless movements in these arts, and they're weird, and he starts moving his hands, and it doesn't look like any technique. It doesn't look like anything from Kaji Kempo. It doesn't look like anything from karate or kung fu. It looks like kind of a mockery of it. An associate of mine, the late Ed Youngsa, who, we were black belts and master ranks in the Goju Dao Te system, the Golden Eagle system, and he used to make fun of my interest in Kung Fu. And he'd like, yeah, there's kung fu stuff. But I mean, that's not an actual kung fu technique. He'd wave his hands mockingly, sort of, sometimes in closer or not so close approximations of some of the kung fu hand techniques. And he's like, that stuff's not going to work. And I'm like, well, the stuff you're doing, the mocking motions that aren't actual martial arts techniques, of course they're not going to work. They're not techniques. That's not kung fu. That's not karate. That's not taekwondo. That's just you being stupid. That's just you trying to be a dick. Okay? And, I would occasionally just pop him with a technique like that. So, sometimes what happens is, and I guess this is everywhere, but this especially, I think, afflicted America in the 60s and 70s. And as much as I love and admire Bruce Lee, I think he contributed to this a little bit with his Black Belt article, Liberate Yourself from Classical Karate. And he talked about absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, create what is truly your own. Good advice. Here's where it gets problematic. How do you know if a thing is useless? You still see this idea. They're like, well, let's pressure test this technique that I've never learned. Like, they'll see a technique on YouTube. They'll be like, let's pressure test it. Let's see. And oftentimes they're like, let's just make it fail. It'll look cool if we can do that. We'll get clicks. But they don't understand the technique. They've never been trained in it. They don't like call the guy or email the guy saying, how do you make this technique work? What's it all about? They haven't encountered it in a seminar. And so, of course, the first time they try it, and often they'll try it in like a sparring situation, it won't work. Pull in. Sometimes the first time you learn how to throw a jab or a leg kick, it won't work. If you've never thrown a jab in your life and never thrown a leg kick, and I'm like, look at this video, okay, now spar me. Spar this guy who's a pro. Spar this guy who's taller than you. Or he's been doing it for 8 years and he's young and fit. Spar this guy. Your jab fails the pressure test. Your low kick fails the pressure test. Does that mean the jab and the low kick don't work? You see the limitation. I think oftentimes, and Americans are very prone to this, Americans are very eager to put on the rank to become a master level practitioner in rank and get the certificate and be called master so-and-so. I mean, I think it started in the 70s where there were more American 10th dans and 5th dans than there were in all of Japan and Korea put together, right? But they hadn't actually mastered the arts that they learned often before breaking off and forming another art. Even think about how long it took for the mainstream idea that when you pull the punch back, the hikite is grabbing and manipulating the opponent. What we would call hand trapping in the UFC today, right? And the idea that many of these so-called blocks had a multitude of better uses. And the funny thing is, a book Gichin Funakoshi wrote, I think in the 40s, actually showed this so-called low block motion is actually an escape from a bear hug from behind, and so on and so forth. And his older book, I think it was called Karate Do Nyoman, showed the pressure point attacks on the arms and the gallbladder points on the sides of the legs, which are often used as a target for a low kick. And this information took until the 80s to start to go mainstream, right? So much of the information that was thrown out was extremely useful, but they had done the motions and never actually gotten to the point where they completely understood all the motions. He said rightly that if you're doing a motion that you don't understand, that confuses you, it's going to hurt you in self-defense. So his solution is anything I don't understand, anything that my understanding cannot decipher, I will just throw away. kind of a master. That's not a master's approach. My approach is, I don't understand it. Let me then strive to understand it. It's there for a reason. Now, that's not to say nothing gets thrown away, nothing gets changed. That's the evolution of the martial arts. But many Americans of different racial backgrounds, nationalities, kind of don't get what happened in Asia. Asian history, about how oftentimes martial arts were outlawed and there were rival clans, and so there was a lot of secrecy. And luckily we have all these resources today, and I love how I'm in my 50s and especially in my 40s. A lot of this information I began to decipher, I began to practice with people, and I'm like, holy crud. And then I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu at 50. I think it was 50 or 51. 50. And after the initial stage where everybody was just, taking me down and tapping me out, I couldn't punch him, I couldn't kick him, I couldn't claw them, I couldn't bite. But then I began to understand Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, takedown defense, how to work from the bottom, how to work from the top. I began to find places for Hikite, find places for Paksao. I even, they grab me, I bong sao, and then I can strip, and now I can grab their gi and go for a take. Like, things began to come together. Okay? And my traditional martial arts, plus the information I got from Chris Thompson and George Dillman through their videos and their magazine articles, all of it for free, it really helped me put it into perspective how to apply this in both standing and ground grappling. Okay? And so on and so forth. Right? Another point about John Hackleman, and this is kind of saddening. I mean, I am not taken away from his great abilities and accomplishment. He obviously is a great martial artist, great martial arts teacher. But if you watch him, it really sounds like he's having trouble speaking. Like he's taken way too many hits to the head and done a lot more hard sparring than he should have, and maybe still does. And I really think that's detrimental. Hard contact sparring, especially to the head, is something that you need to treat as a toxin, a poison that needs to have the right dose and can have a medicinal value. We don't give, in Chinese medicine, we don't give certain strong herbs in large doses. We combine them with other herbs for toxicity to mitigate toxicity, and we won't give them to certain people, or we'll give them to some people but not at a certain point for their own safety, right? Your martial art has to have a bit more than just force on force, what we call external training, right? And have more subtlety, what some people call internal training, and I think that term is misused by a lot of people who simply can't fight, or simply never had a truly functional martial art, and are trying to cover up for their knowledge gaps and lack of ability. But the internal concepts are real. There are arts that are more internal than external. I argue that there is no martial art that is completely external, and especially amongst Asian martial arts, more particularly amongst Chinese martial arts. Many of what some people label as an external martial art are extremely internal, and one way you can tell is that the practitioners live very long, healthy, active lives and exhibit the vitality that we would know as having qi and jing and shen, having it all in harmony and preserved and nurtured. Okay? So John Hackleman, I really want to caution anybody who regularly watches my videos and is either older or getting there, and even the younger people, because if you're lucky, you'll get there one day, against sparring practices that are more appropriate for a certain age group and for certain things. Even pros who are young and strong and fit and competing for millions of dollars and world titles should be careful about how much sparring they're doing and the types of sparring they do. Okay? Some things are not necessary and are more ego-driven, or just done because that's always the way it's been done, that's what you got to do. And again, if you not only learn how to protect yourself from assailants or from an opponent in the ring, but also against yourself, against bad training and anything that could, have long-term negative consequences for your health and your life. I can't think of any area of life that is improved by dementia, by brain damage. Okay, let's call it what it is. At the very least, safeguard yourself from harm during training, as well as training to safeguard yourself from harm out there. That can't seem like a radical and wrong idea, does it? All right, you have a nice day.